Waiting for folks to connect to audio. Hi, Matt. How are you?
Good, Seepan. How you doing?
I'm doing well.
Good.
Matt, don't take this as an insult, but I'm going to mute your video, if that's okay.
None taken. You just shut me down. I'm here to listen.
Good to see you. Thanks for joining. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. It is, in case you may have joined the wrong room, just making sure this is the Houston Bar Association International Law Section. We have an event titled Houston as a Global City, Challenges and Opportunities for International Trade. My name is Seepan Parseghian. I am the chair of the Houston Bar Association International Law Section. I'm also a trial attorney at the law firm of Beck Redden here in Houston. And I'm very honored to have as our guest today, Chris Olson, whose bio I will talk about in a brief minute. I just wanted to lay the context of why we decided to talk about this event and this topic in particular of Houston as a global city. Just some quick stats to kind of lay the context here. Houston is proudly the most diverse city in America. It is the fourth largest city in America. And I believe, depending on the projections, it is slated to overtake Chicago as the third largest city in America in the next 5 to 10 years, if not shorter of a time span. It also is one of the busiest ports in America and in the world, both in terms of foreign tonnage, as well as overall tonnage. And of course, it goes without saying that it's also the energy capital of the world. I'll also throw in there that Houston is positioning itself as a tech hub as well, both for the energy industry as well as the biotech, life sciences type field as well. And that has been evidenced recently with the opening of the ION Center, the Cannon, Houston Exponential, etc. So there's certainly been a concentrated push in the tech sphere, and that's another topic that I'm sure we could talk about with Chris today. So here to talk about Houston as a global city and the challenges and opportunities it faces as it grows on the international stage, particularly in international trade, we're honored to have Chris Olson. His title is Director of Trade and International Affairs for the City of Houston. He was appointed by Mayor Turner in 2018 to serve in that role. And as the director, he leads the city's international business development efforts, as well as engagement with foreign governments and international organizations. Chris has an incredible background, which we'll also be asking him about. Prior to his appointment, Chris held positions as a diplomat, business consultant, and military officer. He was with the US Department of State, where he had diplomatic postings in the Balkans and Southeast Asia, worked as a program manager in DC, supervising programs in Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia, and advised US and international business executives on a range of economic, trade, and political issues. As a business consultant in the private sector, Chris advised companies on corporate market strategy, organizational structure, and business processes. And during his military service, Chris was a US Navy surface warfare officer, leading large, diverse, cross-functional teams. Chris has supported special warfare operations, worked as a staff officer for the Chief of Naval Operations in the Pentagon, and led anti-terrorism and continuity of operations programs. He is a graduate of Northwestern University, and I think you guys have a big game coming up against Wisconsin, right? Pretty soon. Good luck with that. He has a degree in history and political science and holds a master's degree from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Prior to joining the City of Houston, Chris also obtained an MBA from Rice, with a focus on strategy and innovation, where he was recognized as a Jones Scholar for academic and leadership excellence. So I will stop. There are certainly many more accolades in that bio, but I'll stop there, Chris. And I'll start us off from a segue from that bio. And given your fascinating background in international affairs at the Pentagon, the State Department, how did you navigate your way to the City of Houston and to your current role?
Well, thank you all very much, and it's a great honor and privilege to join you all from today, and I thank the Houston Bar Association for inviting me to join. I sometimes get surprised listening to the bio that it's actually me. It's an odd kind of unplanned path that brought me here to the city of Houston in many ways. After, as you said, 25 years working with the State Department, military, and as a business consultant, I built a bit of a expertise in geopolitical risk, in international affairs and global issues, with a specialty of building relationships with senior government and corporate leaders, negotiating complex policy objectives generally. And my background generally has me working in rather ambiguous and unplanned environments. I spent a lot of time in Central Asia, Middle East, East Africa, and the Balkans, kind of the former Soviet sphere. So I enjoyed sort of operating in those slightly more austere environments and frontier marketplaces. Brought me to Houston was my wife's job originally. She's at Exxon. When Exxon moved from Fairfax, Virginia to Houston, I was told that I was coming with her. But what really surprised me the most about Houston is just how international it is, especially grew up in Chicago, spent most of my time in the DC area, be it with the military or State Department. And it just surprised me what a global actor Houston was. And although I kind of knew my foreign service career might need to change based on my wife's job, and was looking at corporate America, I still was planning on heading overseas with the State Department when someone approached me with the opportunity to work for the mayor in this role, which had been vacant for a while. And they saw my background and kind of said, this is a perfect fit and an opportunity at a time when Houston was looking to elevate itself and elevate its role on the global stage. So I took a chance, came here, and it has been absolutely phenomenal. Mayor Turner is absolutely committed to a global vision for the city of Houston, prides itself in the diversity that it has and its international roots, the more than 90 consulates that are here in Houston. So it's been an incredible opportunity, and one I certainly had never planned to take, but has probably more engagement with the international community than almost any other city in the United States. Even those that might be considered great global cities of the US, I think Houston actually has more foreign governmental interaction than any of the other cities in the United States.
Very interesting. Thank you for that, Chris. So for those of us unfamiliar with exactly what your office does, can you give a kind of a brief background of its mission and what your day-to-day looks like?
Absolutely. So my role is, as was noted, I'm the Director for Trade and International Affairs. And in some respects, that means I'm the foreign minister for the city of Houston, as well as the trade representative for the city of Houston. But of course, as you all know, Houston doesn't make policy, either foreign policy or trade policy. So a lot of what my role is building the relationships that can be utilized by Houston area businesses and Houston interests that can be leveraged for either commercial policy or other kinds of gain. We serve more as strategic conveners, where we bring people together, we build the relationships, be that with foreign governments or foreign corporations, that then can see how to do business or increase dialogue with Houston. My office runs all of the city of Houston's trade missions. So if the mayor's taking a trade mission anywhere in the world, we'll organize that. We'll also accompany other trade missions to help sell Houston to the world and why Houston is a place that foreign companies and foreign countries want to do business with. We'll help attract FDI into Houston, and I'm sure many saw that Houston was ranked one of the top global cities of the future for foreign direct investment, something we're really proud of. So we help facilitate FDI that's coming into the Houston area. We coordinate all of our engagement with the more than 90 foreign consulates that are in Houston, and we oversee all of Houston's bilateral government relationships. That's both bilateral within Houston to foreign governments, as well as Houston's participation in multilateral institutions. Some of those at the national governmental level, like the United Nations, but many of them are city networks, like the Urban 20, which is a new engagement group for the G20, the C40 on climate action, Resilient City Network on building more resilient infrastructures for cities, and many others. So it's kind of a neat opportunity to have an office within a city that does this international political engagement as well as international trade engagement, where we're working with Houston area and foreign businesses to try to find ways to increase ties, build new opportunities, and then facilitate Houston companies to do trade abroad.
Got it. Thank you for that, Chris. And so I'm sure within that very broad portfolio that keeps you busy day and night, that immigration certainly plays a big role in what you do. And you know, it may not be something that your office directly has involvement in, but it may certainly impacts you. And so a few weeks ago, I moderated another panel for the HBA ILS on the impact of COVID-19 on the immigration courts, as well as business immigration issues. And so I'd be very curious to know how immigration issues actually do impact your office, and in particular, whether the EB-5 visa has been an effective tool for the city of Houston in attracting that foreign investment that you were talking about just a minute ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you noted in the intro, that Houston is the most diverse city in the United States. 1 in 4 Houstonians were born outside of the United States. So this is a city that thrives on immigration, and one where we certainly are enriched by it, both from a cultural perspective as well as from an economic perspective. And that really includes all levels of our workforce, from the teachers, doctors, professors that are in our universities and hospital systems, to those that are kind of working across the spectrum of Houston's economic ecosystem. EB-5 is an interesting question too, because it's one where all you need to do is look around Houston, where you see all the construction and building that's going on. And as all of the investors were looking at the capital stacks of how to build these programs from an economic development perspective, the EB-5 program was one of those programs that helped entice investors into the US market, and then Houston itself sold itself for entering into the Houston market. What we found is that there was a lot of individuals that were looking to diversify, especially those with high net worth, those that would take advantage of a program like the EB-5 program. We're looking to move out of a lot of the historical networks, looking beyond New York City, looking from California, and Houston was a natural place to try to look to invest. Great investment climate, lots of opportunity, lots of land and space, and a growing marketplace. So that was something that was of value to the city from an economic development standpoint. And the changes to the EB-5 program are interesting because it tends to impact where a lot of investment was coming from with that, which was China. And we saw a lot of the EB-5 attraction from Chinese investors. And obviously with the changes to the EB-5 program, that changes how investors look at the United States as a whole, not necessarily how they look at Houston, but how they look at the US as a whole. Now, we may be more impacted in a longer term because we were doing a lot of investment using the EB-5 with a large infrastructure investment from commercial clients. But I think we're kind of waiting to see what that happens. But I think beyond the specific changes to the EB-5 program from a structure standpoint, it's the politics that surround why those changes were made. And I think it's a lot of those political undertones that are changing whether the United States is an attractive place to continue investing, again, really in particular for China, and whether the changes to the EB-5 program itself will be what might potentially limit some of the investment opportunity, or whether it's more the political tones and political undertones that are going to change that dynamic.
Understood. And before I segue to the next question, I did forget to mention for our participants on the call, if you do have any questions at any point, we would certainly welcome them. You can type them up in the chat feature in Zoom, and I'll collect them, and towards the end, we'll relay those questions to Chris. So feel free to please do ask your questions, and you could do so privately or to everyone in the chat, and it doesn't matter. So I'll make sure to collect them. And if we've got a lot of questions, Chris has been kind to take them as they come along, or we can just collect them and ask them towards the end. So Chris, I'll segue from there into switching gears and talking about the USMCA. So I'm sure everyone here on the call knows what the USMCA is, but just in case, we're talking about the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, which replaced NAFTA as the operative free trade agreement governing North American trade. And I just want to lay some groundwork here with some quick stats on what North American trade means to the Houston economy today. Mexico is Houston's largest international trade partner in 2019. And from 2010 to 2019, trade between Houston and Mexico averaged $24 billion annually. and was valued at $21.7 billion in 2019. Nearly almost 600,000 people living in the Houston metro area were born in Mexico, and Houston-Mexico trade is heavily reliant on mineral fuels and refined products. Canada is a little lower down the list, but by no means insignificant. It's Houston's 12th largest international trade partner. And from 2010 to 19, trade between Houston and Canada averaged 3.3 billion annually and was valued in 2019 at 5.6 billion. And nearly 20,600 people living in the Houston metro area were born in Canada. And the top three commodities in 2019 between Houston and Canada were industrial equipment and computers, optics, photographic measuring and medical instruments, and aircraft, spacecraft, and other parts. So within this very dynamic economic context with our northern and southern neighbors, how would you assess the impact of the USMCA so far on the city of Houston and its international trade growth, and what has worked well, what needs improvement? So we'll start there.
So the greatest impact of it has been stability and a feeling amongst the business community that I've spoken to and worked with is that at least people know what the rules of the game are and are going to be, and have a little bit of confidence that they'll stay that way for at least for the near term. After the Trump administration announced that it was the worst trade deal ever, needed to throw it out, completely scrap it and do something different, that created massive uncertainty in the global and the US marketplace, but really Houston was acutely affected by that just because, as you noted, we have more than $24 billion of trade annualized over with Mexico, plus what we have with Canada. And it just created massive uncertainty. And that was particularly true for the small and medium-sized businesses that were more reliant upon quick turnover of trade. A lot of the trade implications and that uncertainty are ones that they didn't have the capital backing to prepare for or plan for. And they also didn't necessarily have the legal capabilities of being able to understand what might or might not happen or what their exposures were. So what we saw when that was going on, and then is of course the trade battles ratcheted up and threats of 25% imports across all, and we're shutting the border completely to all trade and all goods with some of the immigration crisis. That uncertainty was fairly disruptive to the Houston business environment when it comes to that our highest trading partner. So what the USMCA really did, which many will say is really just kind of a modernized NAFTA anyway, we didn't really throw NAFTA out. It was more tweaked on the edges, improved upon, or just changed for change's sake and renamed. But I think what it did is it did bring it modernized a lot of parts of it. It modernized some of the IP, some of the labor questions, maybe refined it a little more in favor of the US marketplace, like was what was promised. But the biggest gain was from stability and being able to plan for what's next. And I think that in a good way, that now that is signed and there is that stability, that we'll have that as what we expect to see moving forward. Of course, we can't plan for the changes of what's happening in the Mexico governmental regime and some of the instability that exists not only along the border, but within the López Obrador regime. But even given that instability, I think there's some confidence that what is signed is going to remain in force for the near future. So businesses in the Houston area can plan for that. And even if it is tweaked on the edges again, be that under some labor law or minimum wage requirement components, that there is this feeling among our business community that at least we know what the rules are and are going to be. And we can actually, from the Houston economy perspective, use that as the framework for what we can continue to drive forward with our largest trading partner. And I'll just also say that this week we're going to be celebrating the 100th anniversary of having a Mexican consulate in Houston, which is pretty remarkable just because of the longevity of that relationship between Houston and Mexico. Really speaks to what we have from a cultural and trade standpoint, and why, again, the importance of having some stability and what the expectations are from a trade relationship, because that will continue to fuel that economic growth and development.
Wow, I didn't know, 100 years. Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So what about some of the challenges that the USMCA has presented? So, I mean, it certainly has provided a level of predictability Has there been, any downsides to it so far that City of Houston has seen that it would like
So
to?
not that we've seen from the city standpoint. You hear little bits and pieces of as people continue to understand and as businesses continue to understand what the nuances of the USMCA are or might be. I think opinions will continue to refine. Of course, there's some that say there's not enough labor protections. The IP protections are there, but how do we actually enforce a lot of those different components of it? And I think like all trade and like we saw with NAFTA, it does take some time to evolve, and it takes time to see where maybe unexpected and unanticipated concerns actually reside. We had a fantastic panel discussion a few months ago in partnership with the Greater Houston Partnership on some of the legal, trade, and other ramifications of the USMCA, really kind of celebrating it more than anything else because of again, I think more of that stability that came with it. I think that what is still outstanding in a lot of the USMCA is some of what surrounds the USMCA, with questions related to immigration, a lot of that cross-border worker components, whether we can resolve that, and those other issues that are not about the USMCA but relate to the USMCA. And again, really focusing on Mexico within the Houston context, just because proximity and history show just how robust that trade relationship is. Different sets of concerns and questions when it comes to Canada, but I think from a Houston perspective, most of those are worked out. Those tend to be a higher tech sector, longer time frames for what development is. That it was a lot of the Mexican issues that were more of concern to our Houston business community.
Do you foresee the Biden administration coming in and making any changes or do you think they're going to continue the course here?
I don't think so. I think that with this now recently signed and with it getting fairly strong bipartisan approval across the board, I think that this one will be left to sit for a while we hopefully focus on some other issues and other trade issues as it relates to that trade agenda. I think we might have a little bit more fidelity in the next year on some of the immigration concerns. From a labor standpoint, there may be a press from the new administration to keep looking at how we can improve the labor sides of it, to increase minimum wages, to increase some of the labor rights that are incumbent, that were one of the sources of great discussion within the signing of the USMCA. But I don't expect much change to it, just because there's so many other issues going on. Now that the USMCA is in force and went into force in July with strong bipartisan approval, or strongish bipartisan approval, I don't expect anything to change on this one. Got it.
Okay, well, let's pivot from North America to China. And I know that we already have a question here from one of our participants as well related to the topic. So obviously during Trump's very public trade spat with China, Houston found itself in the crosshairs when that tit for tat between the two countries led to the closure of the Chinese consulate in Houston on July 23rd of this year. So the number one question, how has the closure of that consulate affected your office's work, if at all?
Great question. And this was a fascinating issue that once again kind of showed how central Houston can be to a global geopolitical agenda, where the world basically stopped and was staring at Houston as we closed the consulate. It also in some respects showed how unfortunately powerless the city can be on something as monumental as closing one of the largest consulates in the city, just because we have no power, authority, or control, and the city's not asked for our opinion of what we think about closing a consulate. That's purely within the jurisdiction of the federal government. I'll stay out of the big picture political and national security questions that surround the closure of the consulate. I'll be happy to talk about those offline, but those are big and get charged no matter how you want to address them. How it's going to affect us, I think it's a little early to tell. It definitely had a chilling effect to the overall U.S.-China relationship, which, as you noted, was already rough and has only gotten rougher since then. But what has interested me the most is how much of a chilling effect it's had on the city-to-city relationships kind of across the United States on engaging at a federal level. So before the closure of the consulate, you already had a lot of changes that were being made at the federal level of how Chinese level diplomats, at the Chinese national level diplomats could engage with their local counterparts. It used to be fairly open. And then the State Department required that the consulates and embassies provide notification prior to meeting any local officials. Although that slowed down some of our engagement, Houston always had the position that we are a city that's open for business. And we're a city that wants to do business with everybody if it's going to make economic sense for our Houston area residents and our Houston area companies. And if it's going to provide us with economic opportunity, we'll continue to engage, of course, within the laws of the federal government. We continue that throughout the Trump administration, even as national level relations were deteriorating. The city of Houston retained a very positive relationship with our Chinese government counterparts, as well as the Chinese business associations and community associations. When the consulate was closed, although Houston had nothing to do with that decision-making process, around the United States, engagement with cities almost completely stopped. And I've heard that from my counterparts in other major US cities as well, that still did retain a consular presence, that engagement with the Chinese government almost ceased entirely. And that can be said for a lot of the Chinese government interlocutors that we had, some of the media groups, some of the community groups, the business associations. Everything really kind of stopped. And it's been in this frozen status since the closure of the consulate. So I'm not sure how that is going to continue to evolve, because unfortunately, since that time, the national level relationship has only continued to deteriorate. So how that will actually impact Houston from a long-term perspective is something that we haven't seen. Now, Houston still really enjoys robust engagement with Chinese cities on a city-to-city level. We have a sister city relationship with Shenzhen. We're a partnership city with Shanghai. We have 2 other Chinese cities that are part of the World Energy City Partnership, which Houston helps run. That's a consortium of 19 global cities that are part of and leading the energy transition. But a lot of the other engagements stopped, and we're curious to how that's going to look. And back to your earlier question on EB5s, that remains a question too, is if you take, the EB5 change of requirements together with the closure of the local consulate, together with that national level political pressure, will that really have a detrimental effect on longer term Houston-China economic relationship that we just don't see yet? And that can have continuing effects to the medical center, to students that are here in Houston, as well as the manufactured goods that are being shipped in for the oil and gas industry, because a lot of that is manufactured there and then brought here for further fabrication. So it's a lot of question marks that'll be seen of how the closure of the consulate is indicative of what might happen, both from a political and economic perspective, kind of midterm 3 to 5 years.
So on the one hand, we have this going on, with chilling of the U.S.-China relationship, I guess, in this trade sphere. On the other hand, you have earlier this week, China and 14 other countries announcing the signing of what's being billed as the world's largest trade agreement. And I think it's called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. The U.S. is, of course, conspicuously absent from this deal, it lies in stark contrast to American involvement in the TPP a few years ago. And so with the U.S. having pulled back a little bit, I guess, from its Asia pivot, what has the city of Houston been doing to fill that void with important trade partners in Asia, such, of course, as China? And what challenges has it faced in doing so?
I'm glad you raised this one, because it's fascinating as you look at what we were doing with Trans-Pacific Partnership, over the last really 15 years, and how that was being negotiated, and then how quickly China's regional pact was signed is a pretty fascinating development. And unfortunately, I think one where, although we claim to abandon these multilateral trade deals in favor of bilateral trade agreements, unfortunately, we failed to sign any of those bilateral trade agreements that were promised, but also then got outmaneuvered on a massive regional trade agreement. I've started to read some of the economic components and some of what it does, some of what I have read, and I will admit I'm just getting up to speed of what the real impact of it is. it might not really affect too much from a actual point of view in terms of the tariff straits, what the trade opportunities are, because there's a lot of pieces that are already in place that this just sort of codifies, or it kind of wraps in all the agreements that already existed into a single framework, but it doesn't really change much. But it does send a really interesting political signal on China continuing to expand that sphere of influence, whether we view that as a threat or just a natural progression of a growing economy and growing country. I'll leave that for a different political discussion, but I do think it is very telling that in the absence of US leadership in this regard, China has stepped in, and that's both political and economic, and really driven by a lot of the economic relationships that China has. Because the city can't really do much in terms of those bilateral trade agreements or really on the trade piece, we've continued to focus on two things. One is continuing the bilateral engagement that the city has with our various Asian partners that we have strong economic relationships with. We're going to be doing a virtual trade discussion with senior Japanese leadership and Japanese companies in a couple of weeks. We've had some robust engagement with Korea, with Indonesia, with Vietnam, with Taiwan, and a range of other Asian actors on continuing to ensure we have a very robust bilateral relationship that is, because we're Houston, really centered on economic development and economic opportunity more than the politics that go along with it. The other thing we've done is we've had a lot of discussions with corporate partners on what other markets they could use. If you're looking at trying to set a supply chain that is going to become less reliant on China, then how do you do that? And what are other countries that might be options to move supply chain to? Looking differently at Eastern Europe and the Balkans, looking at some other Asian countries that are outside outside that immediate periphery of China, or really that have a different desire for a different level of trade relationship with the United States. How can we possibly shift things back to Central America, to Mexico, or Africa? So I think we've been helping a lot with thinking through diversification of those complex supply chains so that there's not so much reliance on China. And some of that came, obviously was coming years in the making. The COVID pandemic highlighted that when China was the first to shut down. So some of that planning has been in the process for a while. This is an interesting next geopolitical step of creating that bifurcated, bipolar environment for the global system.
And I'm assuming in trying to work towards that diversification that you were just talking about, you also need the buy-in of domestic companies here within Houston. And how has the reaction been to that? Is that something they've been supportive of?
Well, it really we've done it more in response to Houston companies looking to see what they could do differently. As I'm sure everyone on this call knows, is the reliance on China has only grown, and our economies are so intertwined that it is difficult, if not one step short of impossible, to decouple much of that or most of that relationship. However, I think when companies are making choices now of where they can go, or are having opportunities to look to what they can do, there's an increased interest in looking outside of China. Rather than using China as a default from a manufacturing center, or using China as a default for, I'll use it more on the production side, because China, of course, is still a massive market, and there's huge interest in all companies of getting access to that marketplace with a growing economy, more opportunity to sell into the market. But there's some interesting questions now of the cost benefit of that kind of arrangement. And then from the Houston area company perspective is, well, what will be the advantage if we look to West Africa rather than look to China? Or is there a possibility, with the stability now that will come with the USMCA, of looking to move other things that used to be in China back to Mexico? Maybe it was in Mexico and it moved to China years ago. What is the cost of moving it back?
Very interesting. So one specific issue that does get raised in the context, of course, of US-China relations is IP enforcement, but it's certainly not something that's specific to China. I think we also mentioned it with regard to the USMCA and it being like a modernized NAFTA, so to speak, in that regard. Is that IP enforcement something that your office deals with, not just in China, but worldwide? And if so, what kinds of challenges do you see Houston-based companies facing with regard to enforcing their IP abroad?
My office doesn't really touch on that. However, I've done a little bit of that in my previous life, and it's interesting to see how that's changing a little bit. And some more of what I've heard in Houston as Houston evolves itself. For one, it's a huge and massive issue across all of, I think, all of Houston's area companies, especially as we look to our oil and gas sector. There was one just, I think, in the last week where there was an FBI piece of looking for an individual that was stealing trade secrets from a tubing company. So that is alive and well in the Houston region, because a lot of the companies really are dependent upon the IP or the patents that they have. And as you have of course outsourced and offshored all that manufacturing production, there's a lot of concern and fear for what is going to happen with that IP, especially as it's related to China over the years and the challenges of enforcing that IP. When it comes back to what I've seen as an interesting kind of phenomenon is how much more savvy international actors have become at using the US law against us in some ways. I saw that a little bit when I was with the State Department when we were doing some money laundering investigations or helping Treasury on some money laundering things, just of how savvy individuals could use US banking laws to actually protect their assets rather than put them at higher risk. And I've seen that a little bit too on the innovation ecosystem. And as you had mentioned, with Houston becoming a growing innovation hub, one of the interesting things we had seen a number of years ago is that you have a lot of laws in place to protect IP, protect trade secrets, be that from the IP protections and the patent rights to the CFIUS process within the State Department or within the government for national security concerns. But with a growing innovation component and growing technology, what you saw was a lot of early stage investment coming from outside the United States, which then allowed access to a lot of potential future trade secrets, future IP, before it got to that stage. Because as early stage investors, you had access to it by nature of your investment, by nature of your ownership stake in the company, and essentially you could get the technology before it ever became something that needed to be protected in the United States. And it was kind of a brilliant way of using some of our investment vehicles and just the structure of how we were incorporating companies and startups to allow access to that innovative technology, especially when it came to artificial intelligence, things that could potentially have a Defense Department utilization that could be bought into before anybody realized what it was going to become, which was a really interesting way around that. Which again, we don't, from an office standpoint, become too involved in, but it certainly is an interesting phenomenon that I've seen on the rise as we've gone through.
And what types of concerns have different Houston companies voiced to you in your office with regard to the protection of its IP?
You know, a lot of it has been, I think, one is always just awareness. And what I had done a lot of time with before was just trying to help increase the awareness of some of the Houston area companies that didn't necessarily have it, that there was real threats that they may or may not necessarily be aware of, or be that from an insider threat standpoint, be it from a cyber standpoint, things that individuals might regard as something that they're not really too concerned about being stolen from an IP perspective, actually can be core to their company, and some of the baseline understanding of what needs to be protected and how it needs to be protected and what threats there are, and some basic steps to protect that, which I think has been missing in a lot of the dialogue over the last decade, but I think is really heightened in awareness right now.
Interesting. Okay, well, no discussion about Houston as a global city would be complete without talking about energy in some regard. So I understand that part of your docket also includes aiding other countries in reforming their own domestic laws related to energy policy. So I'd love to hear more about what that entails, and if you got some few anecdotes to tell there.
Absolutely, and as we all know, by being in Houston, the energy industry was was already under some threat and assault before COVID happened, and COVID certainly changed a lot of the discussion. So I'll frame this kind of in two ways, I guess. One is what I've seen with Houston area companies and sort of energy transition in general, and then second on what we've done to help some countries and companies. Houston is really committed to being a leader in the energy transition. And Mayor Turner has signed off and put forward a climate action strategy, a resilience strategy. And core to that is this concept of energy transition to a lower carbon energy future. And as the mayor will say, it's not about saying no to energy necessarily. It's how do we say yes to more diverse forms of energy while continuing to be an oil and gas leader, but finding ways to do that that'll minimize or potentially eliminate the carbon footprint through technology, through different kinds of innovation, but also then investing in and adopting newer energy solutions that have a lower carbon footprint to a no carbon footprint as we go forward. That's going to be done through technology. It's going to be done through building innovations. It's done through technology innovations that can do carbon capture. It's done through adoption of hydrogen and a range of different energy sources that are all kind of part of this generalized energy transition. Key to that is partnership with the corporate component in Houston, and you see most of the largest oil and gas companies really being front and center on that. So what we spend a lot of time in doing is connecting good ideas with good ideas and good companies with good companies that are trying to all be a part of this, and how do we share best practices. So one of the ways we do that is Houston is the secretariat for an organization called the World Energy City Partnership, formed 20 some years ago, of oil and gas hubs, but really all of the oil and gas cities, Aberdeen, Stavanger, Cape Town, Perth, and many others, that were all kind of founded on this oil and gas industry, but how we are all looking to diversify and build forward a way that will reduce our carbon footprint. We all have the same ambitions of carbon neutrality by 2050, which is accordance with the Paris Accords, and a range of different things of how do we help one another on these goals while helping make sure that they remain economically viable, so that way we don't hurt our own economies and our own cities by being a part and really by being a leader in this energy transition. So that's one part of what we've been helping do. And on the other side of that is a lot of Houston area companies are, of course, the ones that foreign governments come to when they want to extract their own resources. So again, this group knows well. I'm a member of AIPN as well, and I was at an AIPN event where we were helping work with the government of an African country to try to get U.S. investors and U.S. companies, really specifically Houston companies, to be a key part of procurement of blocks, and then the E&P and the exploration production, and really it's kind of that early stage of what they thought they had from their seismic and history to what they could actually do and sell. So we were working with them to try to arrange some investor opportunities and meetings with different companies to talk about what those opportunities were. And through those conversations, they were very proud of the fact that they had refined and reformed all of their laws on the regulations of control of the blocks and how that money would be used. And we got to the US marketplace, and US investors are like, this is terrible. It was designed by another European country, but didn't work at all for US companies and didn't make economic sense for most of the US companies based on the structure of what they were doing. And from the foreign government perspective, it's all a national resource. So their primary concerns were, well, how do we want more people here to get more money out of it in the end? What do we need to do? So we worked with the government of actually just convincing them that that was the case. And then they had the open-mindedness to say, okay, maybe we don't have the right answer. And we connected them with not only some Houston area attorneys, but also with the University of Houston Law Center and the University of Houston Energy Center to go through a process of rewriting all of the laws again and coming up with a solution that was done in partnership with with Houston-based companies. Not necessarily that the Houston companies were going to be the investors, but what would the laws need to look like to be attractive to US investors? And then whether or not U.S. companies decide to invest is a longer term answer. And unfortunately, it was right before COVID that they announced and put on a big hoorah about their new law. But that was one of the ways where we have been very closely involved with foreign governments on the energy system. We were planning, again, COVID derailed it, but we were putting together an African summit of African heads of state here in Houston. We anticipated getting probably about 15 presidents from Africa to specifically talk about how Houston can power the African future, both from oil and gas extraction to energy lines to transmission to renewables, and kind of that entire spectrum. So I think Houston and the mayor right now, he will say that Houston not only is the energy capital of the world, but needs to continue to be the energy capital of the world. We have no intention of relinquishing that title because energy will remain core to the city. We just need to have a broader definition of what energy means.
Very interesting. And for the folks on the call, please do, we're nearing the end of our topics that we had agreed to discuss. So if you've got any questions, please let us know. So I want to wrap up with two questions, Chris, on my end. One, and I think this was hinted at a few different times, COVID, obviously, and what do you see as COVID having changed? Clearly, it's slowed down some investments and some future opportunities. Has it generated any new opportunities, and how do you see COVID changing the way you do business, both within the city as well as abroad, for good going forward? Yeah,
it's a great question, and it's one that I think we're all still struggling with. The biggest change, of course, is we're on Zoom, and we're able to have the blessing and curse of having everything done through a small camera and a computer screen or a phone screen. Of course, how that's changing business is it's allowing a lot more opportunities to engage with global clients, global customers, and global partners, which is really good because you're increasing the frequency of engagement. But there's some questions of how deep that engagement is. And when you're not able to sort of meet face to face, us being, humans being very, very social creatures, a lot of the conversations that are done tend to be series of sort of pontificating speeches rather than actual robust discussions. So I think that is definitely changing things. What's really going to be interesting to see is how this changes the retail and the corporate office space rentals in a city like Houston, where you have more and more able to work from home, and not only are able to work from home, but have shown they can be just as, if not more productive by working from home. And with the desire for Houston to increase density over the last decade of how do we, and really during Mayor Turner's time, is how do we try to recollapse to create more of an urban environment, both in Houston and Midtown, the Heights, pushing into Edo, Southeast. How do we recreate and build out our urban environment better, both from retail, from residential, and from corporate? You have a sudden flight from corporate buildings and high rises and a lot of vacancy across our business real estate spectrum. Downtown Houston is still really, really quiet, and it's weird. It's great for commuting, but it's certainly challenging for that. So I think COVID could have a long-term impact on how we view working from offices, which will create a lot of challenges for a city like Houston that is relying on sales and property taxes for revenue, and also just kind of how we conduct business in general. And with the large number of new constructions that are going on kind of in the central Houston area, how does that have a longer term impact? We're hoping no, and we're hoping, of course, that a certain percentage will want to remain home, but we'll certainly have a large percentage that's not. And then, of course, when you look at your retail and your dining, those industries have suffered immensely, as have the arts and cultural industry, and our hotel industry, especially as it relates to the convention center, as we've basically had none of the massive conventions we have on an annual basis. And that, again, directly relates to city revenue and the city's ability to provide services. It also relates to all the jobs, especially on certain income brackets where people are really hurting, and the long-term implications of that, I think, is still yet to be seen, and certainly being addressed by the city and by the state and federal government to certain levels with PPP loans, with small business aid. The city of Houston provided assistance for arts and culture and musicians, small businesses, rental assistance, but that's only going to go so far, and people are hurting. So how do we create new mechanisms by which to do that, which doesn't really touch on the international side, but kind of relates to all of our cities in general, as this is a global crisis and cities around the world are facing some of the same challenges. I think everyone's still trying to figure out how best to deal and handle that.
Very interesting. Well, I do think it's fascinating how something that's as local as just relying on sales and property taxes could affect Houston's standing on the international stage,
Mm-hmm.
as being, continuing to being the site of international investment and being able to take that and grow it. So I do think it's fascinating dynamic there. So one question we do have from our participants relates to the weather. And so with regard to hurricanes in particular, and whether the Ike Dike, project is something that, obviously protecting against the big one, hopefully that day never comes, but if it does, clearly the economic impact to Houston on the international stage, given the site of refineries and other energy companies and otherwise, and derivative products are all along that ship channel, and the Houston port, of course. And so, what has your office been doing in that regard to further along development of a project that would better help us prepare for a future big one type hurricane? And if your office does have a role at all, and what can you tell us about that?
So we've played a very tangential role. We've got the recovery office and the resilience office are coming up with some of the plans. A resilient strategy we have is meant to pull in a range of things that will relate to that. I think there's several different ways of looking at that, although I'll take it more in a general term rather than that specific project, because I'm aware of the project, but I don't know too many details on it. Where we have kind of looked at things is, how do we do our climate action? We believe climate change is real and we need to do something, as we discussed earlier, which will be one aspect of reducing carbon emissions to try to limit the effects of climate change. But that doesn't necessarily stop them. It maybe will limit them from becoming worse. And as Houston has seen with 5 nationally declared disasters in the last 5 years, a series of 100-year flood events in rapid succession, there is something wrong and different. Part 2 of that is, how do you build to care for more of that? And that's where we've looked not only internally at what can we do to help create infrastructure that's going to be able to handle those kinds of massive rain events, be that retention or detention, taking care of our bayous, moving water out when you have such a flat spectrum and all that water has to flow to the Gulf. How do you try to manage that water flow? But one of the things my office has been very involved in is realizing that Houston doesn't have all of the solutions, and that the United States doesn't necessarily have all of the solutions, but there's a lot of other countries and a lot of other cities around the world that are facing very similar challenges. What can we learn from them? So we've had, in 2018 and 19, we had a series of sessions with the government of the Netherlands on living with water and ideas of how to manage and mitigate water. We were in Argentina talking to an Italian company that's building these massive tunnel projects to take water and carry it out to the sea. We've had this same conversation with the government of Tokyo, where they have essentially a series of underground rivers that they've built to collect and store water and try to drain it out to the bay, facing a very similar kind of topography that we do in Houston. So looking at what our global partners are doing that might serve as examples for what we can do in Houston. Unfortunately, a lot of those are huge capital intensive programs and projects, and mitigation of these big events is is something that right now it's hard to find money to pay for, because it's something the city can't do on its own. It requires state and national level partners as well as corporate partners. So those are all things that are being done and looked at from both a policy and an infrastructure standpoint. And then it's also how do you just build the concept of resiliency. And of course, with the petrochemical industries all along that ship channel, the importance of the Port of Houston to Houston's economy, I think everyone takes it very, very seriously and is looking hard at what long-term plans can be from both a mitigation and prevention standpoint. But a lot of that is still yet to be seen as what can be done and afforded.
Is it an issue that you see coming up when companies from other countries are looking to invest in Houston? Is that one of the problems or concerns that they raise with you?
There is a lot of talk about flooding. I would say it's been less about the infrastructure standpoint from their corporate infrastructure standpoint, and more about kind of a city as a whole, both the impact of flooding, and then a lot of it though is quickly spun from an international audience to a positive of just how quickly Houston was able to rebound from something like Harvey, and how quickly, although things were shut down, how quickly the city was able to get back to business. So although it is a positive we do not look for, because it's only a positive as a result of a negative,
Right.
I do think there's some recognition of, we do have some real problems on flooding, but they're not necessarily a key driver that I have heard mentioned a lot in those investment decisions.
Understood.
Although with things continuing, depending on what happens next, it could become more and more of one.
Okay. And we'll end it on this question with you, Chris, is what are the big problems that you see being mentioned by foreign companies wanting to do business here? And also, what are the big, problems and concerns that you see and hear from Houston companies wanting to do business abroad?
So I'm going to actually revert the question and change it a little bit to one of that was a comment on your LinkedIn post, which is what people think about Houston. And a lot of it comes down to you have foreign companies that have made the decision that they want to invest and they have to do something in the United States. So a lot of it comes down to, how does Houston position itself to get the investment into Houston rather than another major U.S. market. And that's one, when I talk to foreign governments and foreign companies, a lot of it isn't so far as there's a problem in Houston. It's more a lack of why Houston is opposed to Dallas, or why Houston is opposed to Chicago or Atlanta. And there's a question, of course, that comes one around branding, of how do you brand the city of Houston when every branding attempt that Houston has had has failed, or at least has yet to have the impact that's been desired, be that being Space City or the Bayou City, or as the mayors call our Silicon Bayou. There is continuing attempts of how do you brand a city as complex as Houston, especially when I think Houstonians don't have a tendency of bragging about their city like New Yorkers or Chicagoans do, and I'm from Chicago, so I get it. So I think that we in some ways harm ourselves by not having created over the years this image of Houston that still kind of many, more in the US than international, but many still regard as a cowboy culture. It's brown, it's all a bunch of oil terminals, it's all oil and gas. And they don't realize just the rich culture, the food scene, the art scene, that it's an extremely green city and getting even greener, that the walkability is increasing, that there's a lot of different character to Houston that a lot of people realize. What helps Houston from a global marketplace perspective is that it is mid-America, it is a transportation hub, it is and does have the largest port for foreign gross tonnage, which is a huge attraction. We've got 2 major international airports that are both growing, which is a huge attraction. We have a rail line. We've got an educated workforce. That is not always as well known, but that's a pretty easy story to tell when we start talking about NASA and the Texas Medical Center and all the things that Houston has. A lot of the commentary is, wow, well, why are we not looking at Houston? Which then tends to go pretty well from a discussive standpoint. So it's really, I think, becomes a matter of just showcasing why Houston is such a good landing pad in the United States, especially with no state income tax, no city income tax. Then we can start working on agreements on what can we do for property tax abatements and other incentives that we can start putting in place to actually get the tactical part of a deal done. But the strategic part is where my office really puts its time and attention, is how do we help sell Houston to those international businesses? And then from Houston companies that are looking to export, a lot of it is understanding the trade law and understanding how to export and what the limitations and expectations are on that. And that's where I think groups like this with the Houston Bar Association is so critical to our export capacities, because the more we can do to educate Houstonians on the value of exporting. I'm on the executive committee of the District Export Council, and that's one of the big goals, is how do we keep educating Houstonians of the value of exporting and then providing them the resources to be able to do it.
I think that is a fascinating and perfect way to end the discussion. Chris, thank you so much for your time. This has been a really fascinating discussion, and I've already gotten emails and chats from the folks on the video call saying what a refreshing insight, how refreshing it was that we didn't get to energy until minute 40 of the conversation.
Well, and it's exciting. Again, I'm not from Houston. I've only been here for 5 years. It's an exciting city to be in, especially right now. And if any of your members or anybody needs anything, please feel free to reach out to me, both for political engagement, for foreign government engagement, for problems you have or questions you have related to that. We're here to help, and we're a resource for the entire city.
That's great. Thank you so much, Chris. And I, by the way, also am a recent transplant from LA 4 or 5 years ago. So I completely concur with you on the potential that Houston has going forward. So, all right. Thank you very much. And everyone on the call, thank you very much for joining us. And please do join us in December. We'll have 2 events, one with Alan Crane on the rise of artificial intelligence and its effect on international arbitration, which should be fascinating, as well as a panel on doing business in the Middle East, which will come later on in the month of December as well. So look forward to having you join us. And thank you again, Chris, for your time, and happy holidays.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Take care.